Welcome back. You're still watching Business Morning on Channels Television. On the program today, our conversation is going to be on education. Now, the Nigerian Economic Summit Group will be holding its 20th Nigerian Economic Summit next week, and it's going to be focused on education. And so that's what's going to form the basis of our conversation for today. I'll be joined on the program by a professor of the University of Colorado, Boulder, U.S.A. He's going to be joining the program via Skype, Professor Okigbo. Okigbo, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Good morning, Harriet.
And here in Lagos with me in the studio is a human capital development expert, and he's also the Managing Director, Chief Executive Officer of Talentscape Human Capital Management, Ibrahim Abdullahi. Mr. Abdullahi, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Professor Okigbo, let me start with you. You remember yesterday we tried to have this conversation, but we had to abruptly end it because of some live events that we had to broadcast. But let me just quickly get your thoughts on this. The Nigerian Economic Summit is built to hold next week, and as we know, it's going to be focusing on education. And let me just read out the theme for you. The theme is transforming education through partnerships for global competitiveness. What are your thoughts on this?
First of all, what I have to say, Harriet, is this. There are three elements in the theme: transformation, partnership, and global competitiveness.
True.
I'm thinking it shows a clear recognition that education is key to establishing Nigeria as a formidable state actor on the global scene. And hence, our educational system needs transformation. But also, it suggests that every entity in the nation, government, private corporations, and individual citizens are all stakeholders who must come together and work together to transform our educational system, of which, if we do so, it will benefit everybody in the long run, and education is key to economic development.
So, Professor, just hold on to your thoughts. Mr. Abdullahi, we know, like he said, education is key to sustainable development. You're a human capital development expert, and as much as possible, you interact with people every day. It's been a long time coming, or has it been a long time coming?
Yes, I can take on from there. I totally subscribe to all the things that Professor Okigbo has said, and I only want to say that I have acted predominantly from the receiving end of the output of our educational system, in that I have a prime responsibility in my organization for headhunting and also for recruiting talent for various organizations. Essentially, what we have observed is that over time, the quality of the graduates that have been available in the marketplace have declined tremendously, to the extent that a lot of retraining and reorientation, which most organizations are really not able to do, either because of affordability or because of time constraints, has simply placed a lot of problem on them. As a result, you keep finding expatriates coming in, even from other similar third world countries where the educational systems have been more sound than ours. Without going too far, you find very many Indians working in Nigeria. It's not because we necessarily like it, but there are areas where we have skills deficiencies.
Why do we have that deficiency? Because you see, the curriculum is basically what obtains in most countries. At least we have the basic courses that they always require. And as much as possible, a lot of universities have tried to include into their curriculum skill development and entrepreneurial development courses as well. Is it that this has not really, because I don't really understand, and I'm sure a lot of people too will be battling with it. Why is it that in spite of the fact that these courses have been introduced in universities to, as much as possible, empower our students, why do they come out and still not have the ability to function in an open market?
Okay, I think you have made some assumptions. The assumption is that once you introduce a curriculum, it will translate immediately into skills being acquired. Very often, what happens is that, yes, the broad curriculum can be introduced, but the tools to actually give it effect are missing. The infrastructure and the environment that would allow this to happen successfully is very often also missing. And so you do find that what starts off as a competitive curriculum that is supposed to produce, at the end of the day, people with a minimum degree of skills simply doesn't achieve its objective. I also think that very often we make the mistake of defining education too narrowly. And I must confess, this is where I perhaps would have made further contributions in terms of thoughts to the kind of themes that should be taking place at educational summits. It's all well and good, and I really laud the efforts, but we have to go right down to the roots. Even life is a lifelong educational journey. And you do find that you're not only going to look at one aspect of life. Yes, erudition, going to school, obtaining a certificate, is simply just one part of life. What about the behavioral dimensions? We have very many professionals who have their certificates, who have their qualifications, and they come into society where they're to make positive contributions, which after all is the purpose of a sound education. And what do we find? They join in the bandwagon of simply doing those things that don't move the society forward. And so when people talk about the educational system failing, I prefer to look at it in a much broader sense, whereby you're looking at character formation. All those were things which educational systems try to infuse into the agenda for education. Playing games, for example, is meant to earn one the ability to be a good sportsman, to know when to say, yes, you're better than I, given the rules that were placed there, and you move on. Look at our elections. What happens there? Does anybody ever accept that they're gallant losers? No. It goes to court, even after the officials have been sworn in. The cases go on until they've almost finished their terms. The cases go on.
Okay. Mr. Abdullahi, just hold that thought for me. Let me quickly ask Professor Okigbo. Professor Okigbo, thank you so much for staying with us on this program. You listened to most of what Mr. Abdullahi said, and you were educated here in Nigeria as well as in the U.S., and you've taught here in Nigeria, and you're currently a professor there in Colorado, in a research university for that matter. How would you rate your experience in this environment and in that one?
Well, let me take it a little bit again back to what Mr. Abdullahi was explaining. First of all, our educational system, in terms of its definition, in terms of its conceptualization, is very, very well conceptualized, at least on paper. There's something that Mr. Abdullahi was saying that is very interesting, and it harkens back to what you call philosophy of national education. In 1977, we had the education task for a developing nation, and that is what gave us the 6334 system that we have today, which is supposed to, there was a national policy statement and a philosophy of education that was formulated around which this new system was created. It included some what you would consider national aims and objectives, the inculcation of national consciousness and national unity, the inculcation of the right type of values and attitudes for survival of individual and society, and then the training of the mind in understanding the world, as well as the acquisition of the appropriate skills and abilities and competencies. If you take that system with that in its content and the philosophy behind it and match it, pair it with side by side with that of what we have here in the United States or any other place like Japan or China or Germany, Nigeria's education system is well conceptualized. The problem, and therefore they are comparable, and it ought to be competitive. The problem is not in the content. The problem is not in the philosophy behind it. The problem is the implementation of it. And like Mr. Abdullahi said, the kind of environment, the kind of resources that will bring into the implementation of that very system, that is where we have the shortcomings. So based on my experience as somebody who is trained in Nigeria, one of the difficulties many of our students have when they come over here to the United States, let's say to pursue graduate studies, is you realize that you have all the theoretical knowledge, paper knowledge, but then you don't have the requisite kind of skills and technical the technical skills that goes with that kind of knowledge that you have acquired that will make you competitive in the job market. And so, not that these Nigerian students, normally when they come here, after a while they pick up and they are very smart and they're very sharp and they always distinguish themselves. So in effect, if you think about it, you were talking about curriculum a moment ago. Our curriculums are well conceptualized. The problem is not the content. The problem is not the philosophy behind the system. It is the implementation, the kind of environment, and the kind of resources that we'll bring in order to realize the right fruit, to bear the right fruit in the learning and in the learning experience of students.
So, Professor Okigbo, it is the problem is the implementation. And you say for a very long time, most of the policies that actually come up, everybody always seems to talk about the willpower to implement these policies. And so it's not far-fetched then that we have a well-conceptualized idea, but the problem is the implementation to ensure that it impacts positively on national development, because you mentioned the fact that even though we have all of this introduced in the curriculum, we do not have it, we do not have the willpower to implement it, to ensure that the requisite skills that we want these students to have when they do graduate, when they come into the job market, is not there.
Yes. But again, the question is not about the content or the philosophy behind it. The problem is how do we, and I think that's where I'm thinking, I'm grateful and happy that the Economic Summit is thinking about it, is trying to think about education, because for a long time, whenever we talk about economic development, we always have different, we don't seem to always talk about education. But so it's a laudable move for the Economic Summit to be thinking about education and what can our educational system contribute and how can it become a major participant or bring the two sectors together in order that one can feed into the other. So, and maybe going forward, and we can talk about this a little bit more, we also need to start thinking about the strategies in terms of private partnerships and private individuals and corporations and roles that they can play. Because if our corporations, if our private enterprises, if they are interested in having an educational system that serves their interest, that serves the purpose of economic development, churning out well-trained and skilled young minds that will serve the labor force, then they also need to be involved in the educational system. They cannot just stand aloof and aside and expect the government to do everything. It doesn't happen that way in the United States. It doesn't happen that way in Britain, in many other places.